Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend and prolific author, Parker J. Palmer. Parker is a writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He's founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal. His many books include a couple that are particularly relevant for finding your next calling. So those are the two that we're going to speak the most about today. The first one is Let Your Life Speak, listening for the voice of vocation. And another one is On the Brink of Everything, grace, gravity, and getting old. My wife graciously typed up several different excerpts from both of these books, and you'll find them on the Find Your Next Calling blog and email. Parker also has a new version coming out of Healing the Heart of Democracy, the courage to create a politics worthy of the human spirit. And so we'll be discussing that at a different time. You can learn about all of Parker's work at couragerenewal.org. So Parker, welcome. It's so great to see you again, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's lovely to see you too, my friend.
So maybe you can kind of catch people up on what you've been up to recently, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I think what I've been up to most recently is trying to learn how to be an old man. I turn 85 in a week or two here.
Oh, happy birthday early.
Yeah, and fortunately, I wrote a book about getting old, so I can read, what I was thinking and saying when I was in my right mind, right? but I'm doing what a lot of us are doing, I think, trying to figure out how to navigate the very complex and somewhat treacherous waters that we now sail in or swim in, politically, culturally, economically, internationally, in the world of 2024. And we all know it's a big year in terms of American electoral politics. And so I'm keeping my eye on that and trying to keep my hand in on it as well. Always regrounding myself in those good biblical words, love, truth, and justice. That I think that's the plumb line for everything. So I work on that every day.
Well, good for you. I mean, don't we need those three things in spades these days? Love, truth, and justice. High
Yeah.
priorities. So let's go deeper into the two books I mentioned. First, let's talk about this one, Let Your Life Speak, listening to the voice of vocation, which I think is an extremely useful book for anyone searching for their next calling. What led you to write this book?
Well, it's an interesting book for me right now, Brian, because my publisher has decided to come out with new commemorative editions of 4 of my books, and this happens to be the 25th anniversary year of Let Your Life Speak. So in a few months, there will be a 25th anniversary edition with a new introduction that I've written,
Excellent.
new cover and so forth. I think what led me to write it, it's an interesting question for me because in a sense, it's a book I didn't write as one normally thinks of sitting down and writing a book. It's a book that was put together from pieces that I had written, essays, speeches, brief articles over the previous 10 years. So I think it was published in 1999. And you'd go back to 1989 for the first of those brief pieces, which became part of this book. As often happens, a good editor, Cheryl Fullerton, my wonderful editor for many years at John Wiley and Sons, saw some of these threads of vocation running through my writing and invited me to see what I could do to put together a book that would consist of older pieces, updated in many cases, and then connective pieces of writing as well, to integrate the book as a whole. And I remember at the time I wrote it, I think I was 60 years old. Yeah, that's right, 25 years ago. and my, how time flies, right? It's kind of amazing. But I think at the time I wrote it, I was still, deeply engaged with a lot of younger people through my work in higher education. And and I was very aware of how hungry young people are for their elders to tell the truth about about what it's like to try to find your way down the pathway of life. And I was acutely aware of how often the elders were not telling the truth. They were um, being kind of silly, really. It's sort of like if you'll be like me, you'll end up as well as I've ended up. Sort of skipping over the nights of desperation and
They were still selling, weren't they? They were in sales mode.
exactly, yeah, sort of selling their own experience or
Yeah.
their wisdom. And I wanted to write something that would be, I think, more honest and maybe therefore more helpful to young people. And it makes me very happy that over the past 25 years, the book has turned out to have real intergenerational appeal. I had a case a couple months ago where a grandparent, a parent, and the child of that parent were all in on Let Your Life Speak,
Well,
writing to me about it, talking to me about it.
that's cool.
A three-generational sweep, which kind of made me feel like I'd won the lottery. And and as usual, I learned so much
Hmm.
from talking to my readers and finding out how the world looks from their point of view. Because today, for young people especially, I think the vocational terrain looks really different than it did in my day.
Well, the book has aged incredibly well. I mean, I can't believe that it's 25 years old. I mean, honestly, it's so useful. To me, it's like one of the most useful books that I've ever read around vocation.
Well, thank you. That means a lot.
I mean, seriously. And that's why I, quote from it all the time. And, I'm putting together a class to help people with discernment and then, launching their own business. And, I pull on your book heavily for all that, so.
Well, that interests me a lot, Brian, because as you well know, we've talked several times before about our shared interests in writing and so forth and so on. As you well know, I do not major in tips, tricks, and techniques for people who are trying to do this or that. So I don't have 12 easy steps toward vocational decision making or discernment. So I think it's mainly a book that tries to reflect on experience, to share basic information about the stuff we wrestle with, and maybe along the way, when I'm lucky, a little bit of wisdom about how to hold that stuff, which I think comes along in every life, the discouragements, the dark nights of the soul, as well as the insights, the clues, the leadings, um, and the experiments with truth that we're invited to conduct in our lives.
Well, I think that's the power of it. I mean, honestly, and Frederick Buechner was similar, right? He said, I'm just going to tell the story of my life, and hopefully, you'll see something in it that resonates with you. I mean,
Yeah,
otherwise,
Buechner's a great model for me. I'm glad you mentioned him.
oh
Thomas Merton did much of the same as
yes,
well.
I haven't read him nearly as much as I have Buechner, which I need to solve that problem. But yeah, I mean, what I have read and what I've heard from other people that know Merton really well, have such high regard and say similar kinds of things.
Well, there's something about telling our stories that reaches into the deep well of shared human experience. I think really so much richness lies in the particularity of our stories rather than getting abstract about formula for living.
Well, how could you possibly come up with a formula that's applicable to everyone, right? I mean, that in
Right.
itself, is a ludicrous endeavor. And so, not trying to approach like, and I'm an engineer saying calculus, right? So which is a little bit, I want an equation for everything. That's the way I grew up and learned, but, it's just, it doesn't work that way.
Right, exactly.
Some things can't be put into an equation. As much as I
Yeah,
might
I've
like to
noticed.
try
I've noticed.
it. So let me, if I could ask you about a few different things that you wrote in the book. Here's one of the excerpts. I was in my early 30s when I began literally to wake up to questions about my vocation. So I lined up the loftiest ideals I could find and set out to achieve them. The results were rarely admirable, often laughable, and sometimes grotesque. So what was your mindset at that point in your life?
Well, you're generous to use the word mind, because I think I was a little out of my mind at the time, but it's a kind of being out of your mind that is pretty common in our culture, I think. And in my day, at least, it had to do with this mindset sort of had to do with identifying your heroes. Who was it you really admired in life? And then trying to emulate them. And if you weren't emulating your heroes, you were trying to live into some model that had been provided for you by your parents or by a teacher or by the culture. In my case, what a good white boy of a certain age should be doing with his life. So what the common thread in all of that, of course, is that you're you're trying to discern your vocation not by discerning, but by living up to somebody else's standard. And a big point for me in Let Your Life Speak is that that doesn't work. It is grotesque ultimately for me to look at someone else, say, I'd like to have that person's life, and then try to imitate that person in whatever shape, form, or fashion I can. And I think, I think it's not only it becomes grotesque, but at bottom I think it is. I'll use the word faithless. Um, that faithless in the sense that um, I believe we were all put here for a singular purpose. And that doesn't mean that we're unlike each other in every possible way, but it does mean that each of us is a particular kind of gift. And the gift is one that Merton would name as the gift of true self. And the question becomes, how can I discern the shape of my true self in a way that begins to allow me to live into that shape more fully than I am right now? So from the beginning, you have to understand that it's a journey, it's a long journey, and we're sort of approximating true self, as we slowly discover what that might be, what the nature of this gift is. And then in whatever way possible, we're offering that gift up to the world. Um, I've always loved, Buechner's definition of vocation, which had to do with, as he famously said, with finding that place where the world's needs and your deep gladness meet, or words to that effect. I think I got that
Yeah.
roughly right. I've always loved that because there are a zillion needs that the world has that any one of us might try to meet, but we don't have the gift to meet all of those needs. And vocation turns out to be a discernment of where my particular giftedness intersects the world's vast neediness. And that's a point, a place from which there are things I can do, important things, but I can't do it all. I can't do everything. And so I think honoring the fact that that I have a true self, I have a nature, which means that I have limits as well as potentials. I've never believed in the American civil religion axiom that says you can be anything you want. I know that I can't be
We wish, huh?
An Olympic level runner or swimmer or the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers as much as I might like to be. Um, but I can be what I'm gifted to be, and I think vocation is a lot about discerning that and experimenting your way into it.
One of the things that's kind of fascinating for me in that regard is the place where that fit exists, at least for me, has changed quite a bit during my life, and is yet changing, as we speak. Have you felt that way?
Yeah, I think in its particular expression, vocation is a fluid thing. At the same time, and yes, my expressions of vocation have changed over time. I mean, a good example is that today, at age nearly 85, post-COVID years, um, I'm not on airplanes all the time, flitting around the country, giving talks and workshops and consultations, which is how I made my living along with writing for many years. So the form changes, but I also have felt, at least for myself, that there's a red thread that has run through all of that, and that it's hard to name sometimes in language that that may not suggest the fullness of vocation, but um, for me, I think my vocation has always had a lot to do with being a teacher, which also means being a learner. Sometimes I'm a teacher in writing a book and learning from reader feedback. Sometimes I'm a teacher in a more conventional sense in a classroom. Sometimes I'm teaching when I'm giving a speech around one of the activist causes that I care about. Sometimes I'm teaching as a community organizer, which is work I did for 5 years in Washington, D.C. back in the late 60s and early 70s. Sometimes I'm teaching by creating an organization such as the Center for Courage and Renewal, and not trying to administer that organization myself. I don't have the gift for that. So I go out and look for people who do have that gift, but teaching in the way I hold people in that endeavor to create something new, the way I try to connect the dots between people and opportunities that I see, et cetera, et cetera. So I've sometimes thought, yeah, there has been a stable vocation running through my life as teacher and learner, but it's taken quite different forms from time to time.
So I'd like to read another quote from the book. Vocation does not come from willfulness. It comes from listening. I must listen to my life and try to understand what it's truly about. Quite apart from what I would like it to be about, or my life will never represent anything real in the world, no matter how earnest my intentions.
Yeah, well, listening is huge, isn't it? And it's something that most of us weren't ever taught to do.
Really?
Um, we were taught to express ourselves, even to impose ourselves, to make our mark, as it were, on situations. Um, to give guidance rather than receive guidance, to make statements rather than to listen for wisdom. But I think vocation at its deepest levels has to do with listening to the messages that your own life is trying to deliver to you as you try this and that in a search for the answer to the question, why am I here? What might bring me meaning and purpose? how might I serve? I can give a very simple example, which takes us into the realm of bodily knowledge, because a lot of us, I think, don't listen for the voice of the body. We think of listening as listening to a speaker or listening to ambient noise, but there's other forms of listening as well. So when I was in my mid-30s, still wrestling with whether to walk away from academia, which I had been trained for. I had a PhD from Berkeley, and yet found myself more drawn to community organizing than to professoring at a university. But I was wrestling with that question, and I had a part-time academic job just to keep my hand in um, at this thing called higher education, which it turned out I was meant to serve from the outside, not the inside, but that's a different story. So I had this job, and um, about 9 months into it, I went to a doctor saying that I was having persistent uh, nausea in the mornings. On several days a week, it would hit me, and I couldn't figure out what was going wrong. I thought it was something organic. And he said, "Well, tell me more about when this hits and so forth and so on." I had lucked out and found a doctor who read more than physical symptoms, and he said, "Have you realized that this nausea hits you every time you head for that university job where you have to stand up before several hundred students and do something that I don't think you're altogether certain about really wanting to do." And I went home just started scratching my head and thinking, how did I miss that?
Hmm.
And when I then decided to lay down my university job, um, the nausea went away too. It was all about anxiety, and it's an example of how listening for the voice of vocation can take many, many different forms. And it's a discernment. Always in life, we are asked to discern among messages whose meaning may not be altogether clear. I just gave an example of what turned out to be a fairly clear message once I understood it. But when you practice your vocation, as has sometimes happened when I give a public address about a cause that I'm dedicated to, sometimes the reaction is applause and people throw roses at you, but sometimes people just don't like you for saying what you said. Does that mean you're in the wrong, that you've made a bad vocational choice? No. You have to discern that sometimes you're right on target if you're getting pushback, because there are issues in the world that need addressing, that where things don't always go smoothly, as a sign that yes, you belong here. Yeah. So it's all about discernment, and that, for me, that's a big topic in itself, because I think there are two modes of life that make good discernment possible. One of them is solitude, serious solitude, where you're in conversation with yourself or with some deeper part of yourself. What we Quakers would call the inner light, or the inner teacher, or that of God in every person. Or you're in community and you're moving back and forth between getting signals from within and then testing them in a community which knows how to hold you without trying to shape you, um, which is a big topic and a tricky subject in itself. Um, so the subject has so many layers to it. That's why it fascinates us.
Oh, it does to me too. And this whole idea of listening and discernment. I've been spending more time over the last year reading. And some folks, will swear by the internal aspect of it, the contemplation, prayer, meditation, things like that, which doesn't do anything for me. I am so not able to do that well. Whereas getting ideas from other folks just through either intentional or random conversations. And not all those ideas make sense, right? I mean, you have to filter and discern, right? And use whatever criteria that you have to measure these things. But that's where the majority of new ideas and new discernment and new directions for me has come from. Is somebody,
Yeah,
somebody else
absolutely.
thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wrote a book that never got a lot of traction called The Active Life, in which I made the case that the active life is a mode of discernment. And we should take it more
That one
seriously
out.
because most of us don't live in the cloister, in monastic solitude. We live active lives, and we need to learn, and we need to teach young people how to look for clues of discernment in those active lives. So right on, I think I'm much like you in that regard.
Well, that's one I haven't read yet. I didn't know about that book, so I've got to go out and get that one. That sounds perfect for this topic.
Yeah, it was a Harper Collins book.
So let me read another quote from you, if I could, about vocation. You said vocation at its deepest level is, this is something I can't not do for reasons that I'm unable to explain to anyone else and don't fully understand myself, but that are nonetheless compelling. When I posted that quote of yours online, one person said they didn't understand it. I think I feel that I do, but can you kind of expand on it a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Brian. And I understand if someone can't understand that. But of course, what I'd love to do is be in dialogue with that person,
Yes, yes.
because there'd be particulars to sort out. Um, so let me just put it in the context of a little story from my life. So as I alluded to a moment ago, when I got my PhD, fully expecting to go from Berkeley into an academic career and having several academic offers in hand from major universities, it was 1969. The cities were burning. Kennedy, King, all the rest had been assassinated. And I decided that I wanted to use my sociology in the streets rather than in the academy. And so I went to Washington, D.C. and became a community organizer, work that I did for the next 5 years. At the time, I had a lot of mentors and even family members who were saying to me, why, what are you doing?
Are you
This looks,
crazy?
this looks like self-sabotage. This looks like you self-destruction. You know you're going to disappear off the professional radar and we'll never hear of you again. You prepared for an academic career. Why don't you just take one of those jobs and move up on, the salary scale, and the rank and tenure process, starting while you're young, rather than going off the rails here into the weeds to do something, to create something called the Institute for Public Life in Washington, D.C. that nobody's ever heard of, and that doesn't have a great chance of succeeding. You know you can succeed at academia. What's wrong with you? That's basically their question. And the only honest answer I could give, and I wanted to be honest with some of my dear mentors whose concern for me was sincere. I said, I can't really explain this move even to myself. So I'm sure I can't explain it to you. Um, what I can tell you, however, is that something deep inside me says, I can't not do this. I feel a tugging, I feel an urging, I feel a calling that somehow this work of community organizing is where I need to be for my next level of learning in life and for my next form of teaching in life. Uh, I don't know exactly what's there for me, but whatever it is, I believe it's important. And I feel at a deep level, now these words would have come a few years later. I didn't have them right at the time, but if I had understood fully, I would have said this. I feel at a deep level that if I don't do this, my soul is going to pay a price down the road.
Wow.
It will feel like I've sold out um, to satisfy a level of need in me that isn't at this depth of need that's calling me in this direction. And so, these days, and for many years, when younger people have come to me seeking vocational discernment, we'll talk for a long time. I'll learn as much as I can about their life and the kind of clues that it might be yielding for them. Um, but eventually, if they haven't got to it yet, I will ask them, is there anything at all that you can't not do if you had your way? If it is, if there is, let's talk about it. Something that you feel compelled to return to time and time again. And maybe even now, as you're floundering, you still make a little time every day to go to that and to do it, to immerse yourself in it, to understand it more fully. I'm not saying that you can quickly translate whatever it is that you love at that level into a paying job. But I am saying, excuse me, but I am saying that you don't want to ignore that. You want to keep your eye on that. You want to treat that as an important data point about vocation in your own life.
So, I mean, the experience that you just described and, the decision that you made, um, strikes me as an incredible act of faith, right? Stepping off the cliff, so to speak, into something that's pretty unknown. Um, do you see it as faith, or is it passion more that was the driving force, or, how do you analyze that?
So yes, I think it's fair to describe this as an act of faith, but at the same time, faith doesn't have to be blind. And in real life, there's always a sort of practical assessment or calibration to be done. And that includes, do I have at least a little idea of what I'm doing? Uh, and if I don't, do I have some ways to learn more about what I will need to do? Do I have reason to believe that um, I can get a finger hold on this new step that I'm taking and up the cliff, as it were, and that I'll be able to move from that point to somewhere else to somewhere else. Let me use the bigger metaphor that I've used for a very long time. Gandhi, when he wrote his autobiography, titled it My Experiments with Truth.
Hmm.
And I've always loved that title. What I was doing when I left Berkeley and went to Washington, D.C., was conducting an experiment with the truth of my own life.
Wow.
It might well have been that that whole thing would have turned out to be a fantasy that would have blown out on me in 6 months, but it didn't happen that way. I stayed with it for 5 years, and had not another opportunity come along that was even more compelling, I might have stayed at it much, much longer, because it turned out, Brian, that there was a lot of learning for me to do by getting involved as a community organizer between 1969 and 1974 in one of the hot spots in this country where race and class were really, um, you know, tugging away at the fabric of our society, as they have for a very long time and continue to do to this day. So I was learning to swim in those waters, and it was an invaluable education for a guy who had grown up in an all-white suburb, not only all white, but virtually all Christian suburb of Chicago, where, where the experience of diversity and issues of justice were just not talked about. They were not part of the deal. And so it turns out that I'm eternally grateful for those rough and tumble 5 years of learning stuff I needed to know in order to take next steps into the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. I don't see how I could have done my subsequent work without that immersion in the realities of racism and economic injustice in America. I had a family. I was married, still married, had kids, 2 kids with a third on the way. So it wasn't that I was kind of free floating as a lone ranger. and I needed to find ways to put all that together. That was part of the pressure that began turning me into a writer, because I realized that there were things I could write that would bring in a modest income to supplement the money we were raising for this community organizing effort. So, somehow it all works out. It all worked out in the end, but I love Gandhi's model of experiments with truth, because sometimes experiments don't work.
Exactly.
And if that's the case, you say, okay, I've eliminated that possibility. That one is not in the playbook for me. Now, what's next?
Well, another interesting thing about experiments is that you find things that you don't expect going in, right? I mean, that certainly has been true for me with some of these different endeavors that I've taken. It's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that was going to lead to this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's switch gears a little bit to the other book that I mentioned before, On the Brink of Everything, Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old. So if I could, I'd like to read a couple of excerpts from that book as well.
Sure.
One that was very striking for me, it's a short one, but it says, violence is what happens when we don't know what to do with our suffering. And if that isn't a profound statement that is highly applicable, I think, in our society today, I don't know what is. How did you perceive that?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I saw it partly by looking around at the society you just mentioned and realizing how many people were working out their own woundedness, their own suffering, by in return wounding others, making others suffer. That's an old pattern, of course. I'd seen it before. I remember going to grad school with a couple of people, men, who complained bitterly all through the PhD program about how mercilessly cruel some professors were to their students, including the two men I have in mind. And I thought, well, surely then you'll turn out to be the kind of professor who's kind and generous with students. You've been victimized by this, so you'll understand the plight of the powerless student. But au contraire, they went out and became professors who victimize more students, which
Wow.
it eventually became clear to me that's how they're working out their wounds.
Mm.
Instead of going into therapy, which they might have done, they compensate by wounding people. I had to come up the hard way, so you're going to have to come up the hard way too. And of course, I would see it in my own life. I hope in more minor ways, but times when I got excessively angry at my partner or at my children or at close friends because something in my own life, decisions that I had made, missteps I had made, were angering me about myself. Um, and yet at an even more basic level, Brian, I remember writing that line, or at least one version of it, and realizing as I did, this is what the great religious traditions, the great spiritual traditions, the wisdom traditions are all about, which is offering us something else to do with our suffering
Mm.
rather than creating more suffering on the face of the earth. All of them, in one way or another, have some version of the message, the buck stops here. You know, you, 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 I suffer, you made me suffer, but I'm not going to respond by passing the suffering along. I'm going to find some other path to walk, some other way of holding that hurt, which may include forgiveness. Eventually, it may include a quest for justice. It may include a drive to tell the truth about a situation where systemic cruelty has set in and nobody's willing to face the fact. So I thought, well, I'm glad that line came to you, but I think it comes from a very deep aquifer of wisdom that human beings have accumulated over a long period of time.
So here's kind of a follow-on, along those lines too. You write that the good news is that suffering can be transformed into something that brings life, not death. It happens every day. At my age, I know many people who've suffered the loss of the dearest person in their lives. At first, they go into deep grief, certain that their lives will never again be worth living. But then they slowly awaken to the fact that, not in spite of their loss, but because of it, they've become bigger, more compassionate people with more capacity of heart to take in other people's sorrows and joys. It's like, wow.
Yeah, maybe I suspect that corresponds with your experience too,
Absolutely.
of what happens as we age and we know more people who have suffered grievous losses. Um, I often think about this, Brian, under the rubric of how the heart breaks, how the human heart breaks. And it seems to me that, roughly speaking, there are two ways in which the heart breaks. One is that it explodes into fragments and shards under the pressure of great suffering. And that suffering becomes anger, it becomes retribution. We certainly see a lot of that in American politics today. By people who seem to be driven largely by resentment over their own plight of life, whether they're rich and famous and powerful or not. They seem to be driven by resentment over the wrong things that have happened to them. And sometimes as the heart explodes into those shards, breaks into a million pieces and kind of becomes inoperative, sometimes that heart gets thrown like a grenade at the ostensible enemy, the ostensible source of the suffering. That's one way for the heart to break. Um, but another way for the heart to break is to break open into greater capacity to hold all of life, the joy and the pain, and to hold other people with a kind of grace that isn't there until you've been there yourself, to become more forgiving, to become more understanding, to cut other people more slack because you now understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Or even if you don't, it feels like the right thing to do for someone in your shoes is to extend this grace. It's somehow a healing act. It makes your own life feel richer, uh, happier, more peaceful, more blessed. Um, so I'm really fascinated with the ways that the heart breaks, and I'm really fascinated with the question of how do we um, help more people exercise the heart the way a runner exercises a muscle,
Mm.
so that when the big hits come along, you won't snap that muscle, you won't strain it, but it will flex enough to give. I often think and talk about the supple heart, and how we can make our hearts more supple, which I think comes partly by opening ourselves to the little deaths of everyday life. You know, the friendship that seems to be unraveling, um, the goal that you didn't attain, um, the project that didn't work out, these disappointments that we sometimes just want to blow right by and say, whatever, I'll just get on with my life, but which we might take in as heart exercise to get that supple heart that we all need.
Interesting. Finding ways to practice empathy, right? I mean, from learning from uh, setbacks.
Exactly. And nothing should build empathy more deeply than our own struggles. Um, and, you know, to be there ourselves is to realize that you never know in another person what's going on close to the bone.
Yes, yes, absolutely. All right. So one more quote. You say, what does it mean in practical terms to begin again? I was afraid you'd ask. The truth is I'm clueless, which may prove that I'm actually practicing beginner's mind. I love this. When someone is starting off on a new path, a new vacation, how should they begin again?
I'm glad you asked. I haven't got the foggiest idea. But you know, I think you begin again by beginning again. I mean, I love the idea of beginner's mind, which of course is a
Yes.
Buddhist idea, and it is to the best of your ability to act as if you really don't have this whole thing figured out,
Yeah.
even though that's a hard illusion to shake. Um, we seem to get rewarded when other people think, oh, he's got or she's got this whole thing figured out. But when experience proves that you don't,
Really.
it's a good time to begin again and to say, okay, let me go back to ground zero. Let me open my eyes and ears. This will take us back to the listening, right? So what is it that I haven't been hearing? To use this listening word that we sort of started our conversation with. what is it that I haven't been hearing from either from the world or from myself that might help me understand why I need to begin again. How the tires blew out on this last experiment, um, and um, and find a new starting point and conduct a new experiment with truth. I think that's where Gandhi's wisdom really, the rubber hits the road, because if we understand that life is a series of experiments with truth, we will do what the scientist does when the experiment fails. You figure out what you've learned from that and you begin again. Um, uh, I think that's as true on our life journey as it is in the laboratory.
Well, for me, there's something of a rush to that. I've always gravitated toward the things that have never been done before. We've got a blank sheet of paper, or at least I've never done it before. I mean, somebody's out there's always done them. But even when I was in technology, like I always gravitated to products that didn't exist. There's a new market, new thing that, and I think part of it is the learning that goes along with that.
Yeah.
You're forced to learn because there's nothing else to emulate, right? I mean, you just have to go out there and figure it out as the best you can.
Yeah, exactly. And this is interesting. I hadn't thought of this before just now, listening to you talk. Um, just this morning, I was meditating on that biblical notion that there's a Holy Spirit that's always making all things new.
Mm.
Um, and I think what we're talking about here is really tuning into that sort of ceaseless flow of newness in life, which if we can catch it, if we can see it, if we can feel it, if we can move with it, saves us from a whole host of modern ills.
Yeah.
Boredom being one. What seems to be, and I think a lot of older people really get caught up in this, just the endless cycle of the days, the same old, same old, same old.
Mhm.
One of the hard things about getting old is that you're probably not as deeply connected as you used to be with those people and places and events and movements where things are more visibly made new on a regular basis. But to tune in to the fact that there's a spirit moving in the cosmos that is making all things new, I really think is to get into this stream of constant experimentation where life is is more delightful, more surprising, more energizing, and really more generative of insight and wisdom than it is when you stand by the edge of the stream and watch it flow by.
So I've oftentimes thought of this aspect of things in terms of forcing functions, and maybe that's an engineering term or whatever that I'm pulling out of there. But when we all have a job, right, or a career, or whatever, you have a lot of externally driven forcing functions, right, that cause you to do what you have to do, right? But then when you quote unquote retire, as you said, a lot of folks, all those forcing functions go away, and people don't always have a replacement for that. But if your forcing function is what we've been talking about, learning, right? And going diving off in something new that fits your new landscape, whatever that is, that's a really powerful and energizing, maybe not a forcing function, but certainly a motivating function.
Yeah, exactly. And I think forcing, if I heard your word correctly,
Yeah, yeah.
forcing, forcing function, that's one of the big problems with Western culture, isn't it? We we want to force things. We want to get the universe to conform to our little designs. Um, what's interesting about vocation, as you well know, Brian, um, vocation isn't about forcing yourself into the mold of someone else's life. To again return to the beginning of this conversation, vocation is about listening to what's calling you forward. Listening to a call that hasn't been manifested yet, listening to a call that you're not sure what life will be like if you walk into that call, but you're willing to take the risk because there's new life there. The air is fresher, the sun is brighter. And even if the weather changes, there's another call that calls you forward again and again. So it's the opposite of forcing. It's more like following. Well,
you're willing to take the risk because you can't not take it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So whoever that respondent was who said, I don't understand that. I hope maybe this will help.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think this will really help a lot of folks, and I really appreciate, this conversation and the value of it, the wisdom, I think that a lot of the folks that are associated with finding your next calling can benefit from. So thank you again for doing this.
Thank you, Brian. And I know you're launching a new enterprise here. I just want to wish you all the best with finding your next calling. It's such a wonderful rubric under which to be operating. And for all who are in the world as both teachers and learners, this is a good place to be.
Well, thank you. Again, let me send you back to Parker's two books that we've been talking about. Let Your Life Speak and On the Brink of Everything. You can find them both at couragerenewal.org or at findyournextcalling.com. And we'll be back at some point soon to talk about the new edition of Parker's other book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, The Courage to Create a Politics Worthy of the Human Spirit, which again, we dearly need right now. So again, Parker, thank you so much for everything, and best wishes in all your ongoing endeavors.
Thanks, Brian. Take care of yourself.